Welcome to the Book Show, a celebration of reading and writers. I'm Joe Donahue. The new novel by Tommy Orange, Wandering Stars, traces the legacies of the Sand Creek Massacre of 1864 and the Carlisle Indian Industrial School through the shattering aftermath of Orvil Redfeather's shooting depicted in Orange's best-selling debut, There, There. Starting in Colorado, 1864, where a deep history is told, the novel lands in Oakland, California in 2018, where Opal Viola Victoria Bearshield is barely holding her family together after the shooting that nearly took the life of her nephew Orvil. Opal, Orvil, and his brothers Lonnie and Luther are each struggling privately and secretly with how to live in the aftermath of that violent event, and with the question of what it might mean to heal, or is such a thing even possible? Tommy Orange is an enrolled member of the Cheyenne and Arapaho tribes of Oklahoma. He was born and raised in Oakland, California. His first book, There, There, was a finalist for the 2019 Pulitzer Prize and one of the New York Times 10 Best Books of the Year in 2018. His latest is Wandering Stars, and it is a great pleasure to welcome Tommy Orange to the Book Show. Thank you very much for being with us. What a great honor to have you back.
Thank you so much for having me, Joe. It's good to be back.
Really nice to have you on the program. Did you always know that, A, you wanted to find out what happened to these characters after what you wrote about in There, but also that you wanted to explore the history that brought us to that point in the first place?
I did not always know that. I started writing a pretty straightforward sequel before There even came out. In March of 2018, I was writing, and I did know I wanted to follow Orvil. He's sort of I guess this is kind of a spoiler, but of all the characters at the end of There, who you don't know what happens to them, he's sort of I think one of the main ones that you really want to know what happens. And this idea of somebody in a contemporary times, a native person who is shot while dancing in full regalia, it just felt like there was a lot of layers to write into, to have him and his family try to come back from this violent event. So I knew that there was a lot there to write into that was also have resonance with historical trauma and, ways that the past affects the present. I didn't know I was going to be writing this whole historical piece. This sort of happened a year after I started writing the sequel. I was at a museum in Sweden and came across this article about, it was a newspaper clipping about prisoners at Fort Marion in 1875. And I found out that they were my tribe, Southern Cheyennes, and became fascinated with this piece of history. I didn't know how that was going to connect to this sequel that I was writing, but I'd already started calling the sequel Wandering Stars. And I come to find out when I do research on the Fort Marion prison castle that it was shaped like a star, and there was a prisoner there in reality, in history, named Star during that time. And there was also another prisoner named Bearshield, and that was one of the families. That's one of the families from There, the family I was just talking about. And so I realized I was going to try to write a generational saga that sort of starts way back in history and ends up in the aftermath of what happens at the end of There.
The book has those two sections before 1924, and then the aftermath is the second part two of the novel. In writing that history, that seems very difficult, especially if you sort of wander into it as opposed to saying, I want to write this history and I want to find out. But I assume it leads you, like history often leads you, to say, okay, how did this happen? And then the questions bring you to where you want to get to.
Yeah, and I sort of didn't want to write historical fiction. Native people have been depicted historically 98% of the time. That is the way that you'll find us, as it's related to cowboys or the West or 400 years ago to the Pilgrims. And but I wanted to find a way to bring this historical period to life and to approach these characters from history in the same way that I approach the characters in the contemporary setting. So, have the reader experience their interior and come to understand what drives them and what pains them, and in what ways they're seeking change.
Did it seem to you that it was all leading up to the aftermath, or did you look at it as two very separate projects until it became one, obviously?
No, I started writing into the historical piece with a character named Star even before I knew how I was going to connect. You
Mm.
know, you sort of have to surrender yourself to the novel, or at least the way that I approach it. You surrender yourself to the process, and it's very messy and confusing. When you surrender yourself to the middle of it, when you don't have any answers about how it's going to work, you just allow that, you just trust that it'll come together somehow. Because I already written this Star character, so already started writing this character, and then found that there was actually a character named Star, or a person named Star in history. It just sealed it for me as like, it affirmed something, what I was working on. I should keep going in that direction, and then I would find enough connective tissue to have it all work together as a whole novel.
I was fascinated in reading that first section because one of the things that I find so interesting is that as you're reading it, and it seems like it's a long period of time, and yet it brings us to the present pretty quickly, in the sense of this generation. It doesn't take long before we're at this point. This event happens long, long ago, and as you write it beautifully, and then the history brings us through the generations to the people that we know where, especially if we've read there, we know exactly where we're at now.
Yeah, and I was wanting, there's a weird thing that happens where the reader knows more about the weight of history, the emotional weight of the family lineage, than the characters themselves to some extent, because of the way things did or did not get passed down.
I'm always fascinated in things like this. Did you fight for or against having a genealogical chart at the beginning of the book?
I never liked these things. Just as a reader, I never look at them, but I don't resist them. Like, if the publisher thinks it helps a certain kind of reader,
Yeah.
it's fine. I would never have done it on my own. Just like with the paperback version of there has like a character description list to help orient the reader. It's fine if it helps certain kinds of readers. I would never stop something from helping people navigate a book that has a lot of characters in it. But that being said, as a reader, I never look at these things, and I never would have made one myself.
It's interesting because I read an early galley and it wasn't in there, and then and then I noted as I got the final copy that it was there, and I just found it fascinating, and I wondered how you felt about it. And that was sort of what brought me to that question too. When you look at it, of how all of these characters come together and how the generations come around, it doesn't take long, and they're each, how you do it at the beginning of how they're explaining in past tense. Really, am I right on that? Of past tense as to how, what happened, and this will happen, this will happen, this will happen, this will happen, this will happen.
Is actually future tense. It's a really difficult POV to write from. It's technically called future tense, and it's also mixed with second person future tense. So technically, it took a while to have the thing sound right, because it's kind of a weird one.
Did you say, I'm going to write in this, or is that the way it started, and you say, okay, now I'm committed, we're going to go for it?
I play around with POV and with tense a lot to kind of gauge, in relation to the other chapters around each chapter. I'm wondering about how much immediacy do I need? How much distance do I need? Where's the reader at? Do I want to have this next chapter feel a little bit louder and bring the reader in, or do we need sort of a quieter moment and to be pulled back a little bit? So the chapter before the one we're talking about, we have a character who's talking to her unborn child. So it's a mixture of first person and second person. And what you get in the next chapter is almost a POV birthed out of the POV decision in the chapter before it. So that sort of came about organically, just through experimenting with these different POVs.
Most lives begin and end with great pain. Your birth will mean your mother's death. Look, even now your bloody body is coming out, and up by hands you will become familiar with, will become family with, that do not belong to your mother. So this is the way the story is being told to, obviously, this character, but it's the way the story is being told to us as well. Did you know then, as you were working on it and playing with it, as you say, that it started to feel right?
Yeah, after a certain amount of time sitting with these sentences and with this form, which was new for me, I'd never written anything in the second person feature tense before. And I realized after I'd done it that it was a POV that was sort of birthed from the POV before it in the previous chapter. So there's a lot of experimentation and discovery in the process that is not pre-planned. I don't do a ton of pre-planning. I tend to jump into the writing process. I'll go for long runs, and sometimes I'll figure stuff out off the page while I'm running, and then I'll try to fix it when I get back to the page again.
That's the thinking of the book, right? I mean, that's a big part of it is actually thinking it through.
There really is a lot, and I think writing is an extension of thinking in a lot of ways. When you take on a big project that takes this many years, there is a lot of thinking that goes into it. That's you might just be standing in line at the grocery store and you're still kind of like trying to figure something out that doesn't quite feel right.
Tommy Orange is our guest. The new book is Wandering Stars. It is published by Knopf. When it comes to the history of the book, how curious were you about that history? I mean, you're obviously writing it to serve a purpose for us, but for you, of learning that history of what you knew and the blanks that you wanted to fill in.
Well, you don't see Southern Cheyennes show up too much in the history of Native people in this country. Even when we beat Custer, I think that was mostly Northern Cheyennes fighting in the Battle of Little Bighorn. So the fact that it was my tribe, that was the main reason I decided to write into this whole piece, was because I was fascinated by what, half of the prisoners at this prison castle were Southern Cheyennes brought from Oklahoma to Florida. And it was just, it's a fascinating piece of history alone, but because it was my tribe, I wanted to write about it. And that was the reason it compelled me.
When it comes to, I guess if there is a starting place, as I said, 1864, but looking at the Sand Creek Massacre of that time and what came out of that, ultimately the Carlisle Indian Industrial School, that's a fascinating place. It's a fascinating part of the novel that you write about.
Yeah, a lot of people don't know that this forced assimilation period took place between 1879 and honestly all the way into the 50s, 60s. You had these schools where being Native was thought of as less than, and in many cases, speaking your native tongue, you would be punished for. So assimilation sometimes is a kinder word than it deserves. In a lot of ways, these were camps that were trying to children. It was kill the Indian, save the man. It was, but we're talking about children.
Mm.
So it's a pretty brutal part of American history that it is not talked about and not taught in schools, and I think it should be.
The book is for everyone surviving and not surviving this thing called and not called addiction. Addiction plays a large role in the novel, as did the previous book as well. As far as things that you wanted to explore with these characters when it comes to aftermath, what did that look like for you?
For one thing, we hear these stories about all too often about a shooting, a school shooting, a public shooting, and we get a number and we or become very curious about the crazy guy who did it. But we don't often hear the story about what is it like to come back from that experience, whether you were shot or just nearby and heard it. So I thought it was interesting to follow Orville and think about what the process of coming back would have been like for him. And at the same time, we're in the middle of this opioid crisis and people, get prescribed this medication that's super addictive. And for some people that they have it in their family line to become addicts. Other people it's just, prey to the pharmaceutical companies. So there was all these things, these layers to write about that I thought was interesting in thinking about history and the present and how they talk to each other and addictions it is something that affects a lot of different communities for a lot of different reasons. And I just wanted to write about this certain set of circumstances and how this family gets through it.
In the dedication that I read, I mean, what you realize is that, and I don't think there's any of us who are listening to this, myself included, who don't know and have seen close up the ravages of addiction. And what you look at is how it plays out in ways that are fascinating, but you give it a complexity that it so deserves. And I think that's what is so beautiful of how you write about it. There's nothing easy. There's nothing simplistic about it. It is complex, and perhaps, and I would assume it's why it's so difficult to conquer in any real way, because it is so complex.
Yeah, and that's definitely something that I wanted to bring to the depiction is the complexity. I mean, I think we've heard of versions of the story that are oversimplified, or like the simplicity of like they were in pain and they went to numb it is not really a story about the complexity of addiction and the reasons why it draws so many people in. It's as complex as the human experience itself. The reasons why people feel they need to use something as an agent of change. People are really yearning for something else, and they go off into substances for that thing. And there's a lot of complex reasons why people end up in these cycles of addiction. And I just really wanted to get at a lot of that complexity. And, some people go to substances to feel something having already been numb. And that's much different than the way it gets portrayed a lot of the time is that simple sort of numbing quality is not always the story.
And to that, you write about Orville that he reflects on how the drugs make him feel better because he felt in ways he hadn't allowed himself to feel before, brave and confident, like he could feel that he had kept hidden before without even meaning to. And then you note that at the same time he wants to return to the normality of life before he was shot, saying even if normal was never all that good in the first place. And you're looking for something that you never really had, ever.
Yeah, and I think that line and that feeling, I think was also influenced by, 2 years of this I wrote during the pandemic and after the pandemic, and there was this idea of like, let's get back to normal, as if everything pre-pandemic was this utopian society. And there was this way of looking back because we were stuck in that place for a long time, as if things were great before. And we all know that it's never as good as we want it to be when we need it to be this thing that we long for, like this return to a great country, the way things used to be, this sentiment that you hear all the time from people who resist change. This idea that things were better before is a constantly moving target.
You also write, and I know we talked about this for the last novel, but this also brings us to the subject of, and it seems a point that you want to make and you continue to make, which is of how many Native Americans live in rural settings as opposed to what we would think of, what a great majority of people would feel in the center of the country, as it were.
I think it's still kind of an issue. If you think about, let's just say the past 15 years, 80% of Native people have been living in cities. Now, 80% of, there's around 5 million of us, right? That's like 4 million people, let's just say. I don't know if the math is right on that.
Close,
Um,
yeah.
we're talking about 10 years, 15 years of stories of people relating to cities, of taking public transportation, of having jobs in offices, of being homeless, of being real estate moguls. The lives of modern people living in cities. There's so many about us that aren't out there, and I think we need more of these types of stories. And I think there's resistance to the idea that it maybe is not palatable because it's so expected that, or we still want these cowboy, Indian, these rural wilderness reservation stories because that's what we're comfortable with seeing, and that's what the only thing that's proven to work or whatever. I think we need more stories like it because there's a ton of stories to be told and a ton of experience that Native people have in this environment, this modern environment that for whatever reason it feels like we're still slow to accept.
And yet you still have a strong
Well,
relationship with the natural world.
I mean, I I don't know that my relationship to the natural world is any stronger than the next person. I love the city.
What brought that up was the idea of you running through the city. I mean, you want to get out and explore it. That was sort of where I was. What gave me the idea of having a connection to it, to be out in it.
I do, and I run the trails in the redwoods in Oakland, and I love that too. But I see it all as being connected. A lot of times we think of cities as being this sort of unnatural abomination on the earth, but it's like, if aliens came to visit, they wouldn't see buildings as not coming out of something that earthlings made the way we look at like super ant colonies and see the stuff that the ants made. We don't
Mm.
we don't think that it's artificial. We just see it as these ant things. These are like earthling things that everything comes from the earth. A lot of times we hold this biblical sort of tenet of we hold dominion over the earth. God gave us the earth and we're separate from it. And this brings about a lot of problems around, climate change and not taking care of the earth and having a relationship to the earth because we're a part of it. Rather, this biblical sort of we hold dominion over it. It's ours to own as property and as a resource to mine. These are all problematic ways of thinking about what the earth is.
Let me end with this question because I kept thinking about it between there and this novel, and there have been so many shootings, so many school shootings, so many mass shootings in this country. And after you had written about one so incredibly and impactfully, what is it like? Do you have a different relation to the subject as even as you're exploring the aftermath in the novel as these events continue with regularity in this country?
I mean, I try not to feel jaded. It's hard not to start to feel numb about it or powerless. And then on the other side of that, just feeling rage, there's no other country in the world that has the same types of gun laws as us. And there's also no other country in the world that experiences gun violence like we do, that has these mass shooter events. And yet, because of money and vaguely the Second Amendment and defending ourselves against a tyrant king, we cannot change these laws. We cannot stop this from happening. It's enraging, and then it's also, you can feel really powerless. And so I hope to keep feeling things about it because numbness and apathy is not going to do anything for anybody. but it is also related to this country's history. This country was taken by armed robbery, essentially. Guns were a huge factor in the taking of the land from its original people. Um, there's no two ways about it. And you know, I think there are ways that we're being haunted by the past because we're not willing to look at it closely enough.
Okay, I lied. One more question. There is the haunting. Does anger creep in?
From me,
Yeah.
yeah, anger is always there. But you have to use a useful amount of anger to drive certain energies forward. You know, I don't think anger is in and of itself a problem. It's a natural reaction that you have to learn how to harness and control. But there's definitely lots of anger about the ways this country fails to see itself and to study history.
The name of the new novel is Wandering Stars by Tommy Orange. It is published by Knopf. Tommy, it's always a pleasure to speak to you. Thank you so much for being with us, and thank you for the incredible novel. It's a great honor to speak with you again.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you so much for
Be
having me.
well. Thank you very much.
You too.
Tommy Orange's new novel is Wandering Stars. It is published by Knopf. Thanks to our producer, Sarah LeDuc. Write to us at book@wamc.org. The latest on National Productions programs is available via the Airwaves newsletter at wamc.org and on social media and WAMC Radio. Bookmark us for next week. And thanks for listening for The Book Show. I'm Joe Donahue.